All right, so Senator Elizabeth Warren has kind of been popping off recently. She had a couple of clips over the last couple of days that have gone viral. One of them, she was sparring with the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, and pushing him on his current Fed policy to throw millions of Americans out of work with the rising of interest rates. And then the other one is the first one we're going to look at today, with Elizabeth Warren on CNBC literally laughing in the face of this host on this network at the idea that the banks, in the wake of the collapse of SVB and Signature Bank and then the subsequent bailouts, the idea that she was pushing that basically these banks have the ability to regulate themselves and that we don't need further regulations from the government in response. So let's go ahead and watch this absolutely ridiculous clip here.
I guess what I'm saying is that even those are smaller,
that's why we need to change the law.
Even those are much smaller, though, than the bigger banks that are more than $250 billion. And we've had a number of those CEOs on the shows in the last few days. Fifth Third, Schwab. They do their own stress testing. Not everyone was behaving in a risk profile, in a risk manner that Silicon Valley Bank was. That's all.
I'm sorry. I taught school for many, many years, and I did not let my students do their own testing. The testing that is meaningful is the testing that comes from the outside. And it's also the testing where you don't give the answers in advance. The whole point of stress testing is for someone on the outside of the bank to say, what could go wrong here? And to make sure that the bank could withstand those kinds of problems, like a sudden increase in interest rates. That's the point behind the stress testing. And for these banks to say, not to worry, we're testing ourselves, is truly laughable.
Okay, so again, great take there from Elizabeth Warren. She's 100% correct. I mean, the thing that initially stood out to me in this clip was at the beginning where the CNBC host is basically like bragging about her sort of like corrupt access journalism with some of the CEOs of the largest banks in the country. And she's like, well, I've been talking behind the scenes to some of these CEOs and they tell me that everything's just fine and that we don't need any more oversight or regulations on the banking system. It's like, no shit. Of course they're going to say that. What else would they say? This is all in service of their bottom lines, and you have a network here like CNBC that is basically a propaganda wing for Wall Street and for these wealthy ghouls. Okay, so that part of it was absolutely hilarious, but then she goes on to suggest in a laughable way, as Senator Warren was pushing out there, that these banks can just be trusted to handle all of this internally. I mean, that's like, as she said, you wouldn't give a student the test beforehand, right? You wouldn't let a student craft their own test and then take it themselves, right? It would be kind of rigged. They have an incentive to make it go well on their end, right? To cover up some of the mistakes that they otherwise would have made. I mean, this would be, as crazy as allowing, for example, the U.S. military to investigate their own war crimes, or the U.S. police to investigate police misconduct, or, a multitude of other examples. Maybe, allowing Norfolk Southern, the train company, to conduct their own testing into the air and water toxic qualities in East Palestine. Those would all be equally insane, and those are all things that we also allow to happen in this country, okay? So, I mean, again, the idea is just laughable at face value. So shout out to Elizabeth Warren for not even taking that idea seriously and then explaining why, yes, we do need a lot of these regulations. And keep in mind, some of the reason why this SVB collapse happened outside of just them sort of over leveraging themselves when it came to their investments in bonds that were tied directly to the interest rates that obviously have been going up over the last number of months, according with Fed policy. But beyond just their, leveraging on some of those treasury bonds and some of the other mistakes that they made and not having enough cash on hand and liquid assets and all of that. On top of all of those things, I mean, this was the result. This collapse of SVB and Signature Bank was at least partially the result of the undoing of previous regulations that had been put in place in response to the '08 financial crash. And what she was referencing there at the end of the clip was basically that they raised the threshold, and I talked about this in my previous video on SVB. They raised the threshold under the Trump administration after a massive lobbying blitz by some of these banks from $50 billion to $250 billion in terms of your total size as a bank, where some of these more enhanced regulations and oversight measures like stress testing would have to take place. So you take a bank like Silicon Valley Bank, which just over the last couple of years exceeded that $50 billion threshold, and now I think they're upwards of $170 billion or somewhere close to that. So now they're in this weird middle ground after the rolling back of those regulations, and they are not faced with some of those more stringent stress tests and other measures that could have potentially revealed the fact that they didn't have enough assets, liquid assets, in order to meet the type of pullout from their depositors that they ended up seeing. So, I mean, this is a pretty simple situation. I mean, obviously there's a lot of complex stuff that underlies our financial system and the tech sector specifically, which has been getting hit especially hard as all of this, free-flowing cash as a result of low interest rates over the last decade has started to dry up. There are a lot of nuances and complexities in this, but at the end of the day, it's really not that complicated. So for her to pretend that, this is some sort of a situation where regulation would be overbearing or something like that, it's just completely ridiculous. I mean, that's like the bare minimum we could do. Now, there are a couple other pieces that I wanted to touch on here before we get to that last Elizabeth Warren clip with her talking to Jerome Powell, which also ties into this story as well. But the Lever has been doing, honestly, the best reporting on this entire situation. So here from David Sirota and Julia Rock, they point out that the Fed insisted that SVB posed no serious risk to the financial system. So they say less than 2 years before the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell cited systemic risk as a justification to rescue SVB depositors, Powell approved the same bank's merger application, insisting that the new, larger institution would present no significant danger to the wider financial system, according to documents reviewed by the Lever. So in other words, the exact opposite of what they used as a justification to bail out the depositors, right? So you could have a bunch of different arguments surrounding whether or not there was going to be this massive risk of contagion around the rest of the economy. You can have debates around that and how maybe you did need to bail out some of these depositors, but the way that they went about doing this, I mean, they basically give them special lending functions now where, they're basing the value of their assets on what it was before instead of what it was after the crash. So they're giving them, enhanced lending procedures that these companies are going to be allowed to use. Of course, you don't have like a direct bailout of some of the executives, the CEOs, the shareholders at this company, but a lot of them already cashed out just before it collapsed, which honestly should, according to some standards, probably land them behind jail bars if you're, that this crash is coming and then you cash out right beforehand and they're paying out bonuses like an hour before the FDIC took control of this. But, there's a lot of different debates in terms of how they should have gone about handling this. But another thing that they did on top of, the changing the standards for the lending to this company, right? Another thing that they did was they basically bailed out all of these depositors over the FDIC insurance threshold, which is $250,000. And by doing that, they're kind of giving the impression that the entirety of a lot of these regional banks like SVB are now backed up by the federal government in their entirety, not just the $250,000 threshold. And another thing to keep in mind is, number one, that would basically be the U.S. government backing up trillions of dollars in all of these banks across the country, which at that point you might as well just nationalize them because you're just socializing all of the losses. You're giving a guarantee across the board and allowing them to continue to privatize the gains at the expense of the American people. But, there was another thing that was asked by this Republican Senator James Lankford specifically on this, because if you're not claiming that you are going to be backing up the entirety of the American banking sector and that you just made one specific exemption for SVB and a Signature Bank in this specific situation, and you're not going to be backing up above that $250,000 threshold FDIC insurance for the rest of these banks, well, then there's some follow-up questions to that were asked again by James Lankford. So he said, if the U.S. is backstopping SVB and Signature deposits, but not those of smaller community banks like those in his state, then why wouldn't people rush to withdraw money there and move them to a bank with federal backstopping? Okay, so that's a good question there, right? Because on the one hand, again, if you're coming out down on the side that yes, the U.S. government is now fully going to guarantee any deposits even over $250,000. And keep in mind, the SVB depositors, for the most part, they weren't like small mom and pop, operations or something like that. These were massive venture capitalist-backed tech startups and shit like that. So I'm not going to feel too bad if some of them lose some of their money and they weren't bailed out. But at the same time, you also have a question like this, which is like, okay, if you're saying that you are not going to be backstopping the rest of these banks around the country, well then why wouldn't people just withdraw their money, especially if they have over $250,000, and put it in a bank that is larger that would have that backstopping from the federal government, because they've essentially decided that they are too big to fail. So this would honestly result in the further monopolization of the banking industry if that's the route that they're going to go, and it looks like that's exactly what they're doing. So that's my update here for you guys on that SVB side of this. We also have this update here from CNN pointing out that the DOJ and the SEC are now apparently launching an investigation into SVB's failure. Now, Is this going to result in some executives being thrown behind bars? No, there's pretty much a 0% chance of that happening. It didn't even happen back in '08 when, honestly, some of the crimes that were committed at the upper echelons of Wall Street were even more egregious than it looks like what this situation is. But then we also have this aspect of it, which I also wanted to tie in here at the end. I'm not going to play this clip here, but I think that this is an important part of this SVB conversation, just the dichotomy between how our government responds to bailing out wealthy venture capitalist-backed tech companies or tech startups, right, in Silicon Valley versus how they react to helping or hurting average working class people. So basically here from the recount, this was again from Elizabeth Warren grilling Jerome Powell, the Fed chair. And so he says basically we are taking the only measures that we have to bring down inflation, which is kind of true, but I'll circle back around to that here in a second. And Warren responds saying, and putting 2 million people out of work, which is the current estimation, is just part of the cost and they just have to bear it. Okay, so the reason why I tie this in to the SVB conversation is because look at how they're handling this, systemic risk to average working class Americans with inflation. Now, first of all, as I've been talking about extensively on this channel, we all know what the primary driver of inflation has been over the last couple of months and years. It has been corporate greed, okay? By many estimates, that accounts for an outright majority of inflationary pressure within this country, okay? So the response to that would have to go through Congress, right? You would have to set either, price controls or something like that. You would have to pass, legislation on like a windfall profits tax, something like that, right? You would have to actually challenge the power of these corporations and them, basically just price gouging the American people and using the narrative of inflation in order to justify it. Okay, that's something that would have to be done through Congress. And Jerome Powell is right in the one sense, right? He's wrong about the fact that as a country, the only response we can have to inflation is to jack up the interest rates and throw people out of jobs. But he is right in the fact that this is the only tool that the Federal Reserve has to even theoretically address inflation. And there's not even really solid evidence that his approach is going to significantly tackle the brunt of inflationary pressure within the economy. So here's the dichotomy. When it comes to average working class people facing, a potential of a recession or facing all of this inflationary pressure, the solution from our government, from the Federal Reserve in this instance, is to essentially say we have no choice but to force millions of Americans out of work in order to try to, save some money on labor costs and reduce some of that pressure within the economy and basically make it so that people's situations are even worse. They're thrown out of jobs, they can't afford basic goods and stuff like that. That will reduce demand, and then voila, we're going to be able to address inflation in a meaningful capacity. That's the solution when it comes to something that is materially affecting the lives of working class people. But then when it comes to Silicon Valley ghouls, they basically just backstopped the entire industry, temporarily at least, okay, bailed out a lot of these multi-million dollar, in some cases probably multi-billion dollar corporations and, Silicon Valley bros, and that's how they handle that kind of a situation. So again, listen, you could have disagreements about how exactly they went about handling this and how exactly they went about doing and structuring this bailout, where they left the executives, they left the shareholders kind of somewhat hanging out to dry and bailed out some of the depositors. But at the end of the day, the lesson here is very clear. It's just about who our government serves. They serve the wealthy Wall Street elite, and they absolutely, at every chance that they can possibly get, choose to screw over average working class Americans.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying